May 1945. The German Reich has collapsed, leaving the Allied armies with millions of former enemy personnel. Among them, columns of uniformed women. These were not frontline infantry, but indispensable auxiliaries, serving everywhere from anti-aircraft batteries to command posts. The Wehrmacht Helferinnen. For the victorious U.S. Army, these women represented a complex legal and logistical puzzle. How should they be categorized? As prisoners of war, protected by international treaties, as civilian internees requiring political screening, or as something far worse? Their fate, from surrender to camp life, was defined by which legal box the American military placed them in. This is the forgotten history of the German women caught in the massive machinery of the American occupation.
The initial processing of these female detainees was determined not by military fiat, but by the laws of war. The 1929 Geneva Convention demanded that captured women be accorded special respect and treated with all the regard due to their sex. This simple humanitarian clause created an immediate operational headache for the U.S. Army. The chain of custody procedure, search, silence, segregate, could not rely solely on male GIs. To comply with international law, the Army was forced to utilize women from the Women's Army Corps, or WWII, to handle the physical aspects of detention. The Women's Army Corps, meant primarily for administrative support, suddenly inherited a critical military police role, enabling the legal and appropriate detention of thousands of enemy women. As U.S. forces advanced into Germany and Bavaria, the logistical challenge mounted. Photos from May 1945 show female auxiliaries surrendering en masse to the 7th Army. But this mass surrender occurred against a backdrop of horror. The liberation of camps like Dachau and Ohrdruf profoundly colored American perception, leading to a heightened punitive intent toward any German personnel suspected of atrocities. For every captured auxiliary potentially entitled to POW rights, there were civilian women held for political affiliation and a smaller, terrifying group of female guards. The initial triage often lumped them all together until military intelligence could sort their status, separating bona fide military auxiliaries from civilian political risks and perpetrators from passive followers.
The WWII's unexpected function in the European theater was critical to maintaining order and adherence to the laws of war. WWII personnel literally drove military vehicles, performed security, and actively bossed enemy female prisoners of war. This was a direct consequence of the legal mandate that required female captors for searching and guarding, placing American servicewomen in direct roles of authority over enemy women. This forced the expansion of roles for American women, indirectly challenging the prevailing institutional gender bias within the male-dominated military establishment. It was an essential, if largely unheralded, operational function required to uphold the humane standards enshrined in international law, an integrity the Army desperately needed to demonstrate. For German women correctly identified as uniformed military auxiliaries, the designation as prisoners of war provided substantial protections. The treatment afforded to German POWs in U.S. custody, both abroad and, notably, on the American mainland, was intentionally exemplary. Captured male POWs, for instance, received abundant rations, often exceeding 3,000 calories per day, including fresh milk and coffee. This level of care was a part of a conscious counter-propaganda strategy, designed to shatter the Nazi narrative of American weakness and decadence by showcasing American affluence. Female POWs were subject to similar, relatively favorable conditions far removed from the resource shortages plaguing post-war Germany, thus adhering to the Geneva Convention's requirements for humane treatment and maintenance of mental and physical health. Far different was the fate of German women categorized as civilian internees, or CIs. These were German civilians held not for military service, but for political reasons, such as mandatory arrest based on high-ranking Nazi affiliations defined by the Joint Chiefs of Staff Directive 1067. This process aimed to purge Nazi influence from society, denazification. In the U.S. zone, facilities like Civilian Internment Camp 76, situated at the former Hohenasperg prison near Ludwigsburg, housed female detainees classified as political risks. Although international commitments meant CIs were granted treatment substantially similar to POW standards, the punitive political goal meant these detainees faced protracted, agonizing uncertainty about their future.
The path to release for civilian women was dictated by the long, bureaucratic crawl of denazification. To be cleared, every civilian internee had to complete the massive political questionnaire known as the Fragebogen. The subsequent screening process, managed by the Office of Military Government for Germany, OMGUS, was crippled by a massive shortage of intelligence staff and typists. This inefficiency resulted in lengthy, arbitrary detentions that stretched well into the occupation period. The system only began to ease in late 1946 when the U.S. transferred responsibility for the camps and the trial processes to German officials. Releases were then granted primarily for those declared not incriminated by local tribunals or deemed medically unfit, but not before many spent years separated from their families. A separate, most punitive destiny awaited women identified as concentration camp guards. These Aufseherinnen, or female supervisors, formed the brutal auxiliary staff of the Nazi camp system at sites like Ravensbrück and Dachau. Although they were not formal members of the male-only SS organization, they were classified by the Allies not as routine POWs, but as war criminals, immediately subjected to legal scrutiny. These women were crucial to the machinery of forced labor and mass murder. Their training, including ideological sessions and instruction on how to handle and shoot their weapons, prepared them for systematic cruelty. These female perpetrators represented the collapse of the supposed moral barrier of gender in the perpetration of Nazi atrocities. The interrogations of these captured female guards provided stark evidence of ideological radicalization. One chilling example is the testimony of Aufseherin Erna Petri. She openly confessed to shooting Jewish children who had escaped transport, deliberately aiming for the neck. Her justification was a twisted desire for validation. Petri stated explicitly, "I wanted to show them that I, as a woman, could conduct myself like a man. So I shot 4 Jews and 6 Jewish children. I wanted to prove myself to the men." Such accounts revealed that participation in violence was deeply entwined with a warped sense of Nazi gender identity, shocking investigators and reinforcing the Allied determination to pursue justice for crimes that transcended military necessity. The U.S. Army concentrated its war crimes prosecutions at the former concentration camp site in Dachau, seeking justice for 1,676 lesser war criminals between 1945 and 1947. Among them was the war's most infamous female defendant, Ilse Koch, the wife of the former commandant of Buchenwald. Koch was the sole female among 31 defendants in her August 1947 trial. Her alleged sadism, including the sensationalized, though unproven, claim of making lampshades from human skin, ignited global media frenzy. This public spectacle often framed her crimes as an act of singular feminine monstrosity, rather than recognizing the systematic nature of female participation in the Nazi murder machine. Dachau thus became the stage where the U.S. attempted to reconcile the immediate need for retribution with the complex requirements of military justice. Female war criminals convicted by the U.S. military tribunals were segregated from both the male prisoners and other civilian internees, often held in repurposed civilian prisons. Meanwhile, for the majority of civilian internees held in places like Hohenasperg, political priorities began to determine their release.
By late 1946, the focus of the occupation shifted dramatically. The emerging Cold War against the Soviet Union superseded the meticulous process of purging Nazis. Denazification, deemed cumbersome and unpopular, was relaxed, and its processes handed over to German state tribunals. The long, drawn-out detentions of women held merely for affiliation were increasingly seen as an administrative liability, setting the stage for the final wave of releases as political expediency paved the way for German reintegration.
While the trials of concentration camp personnel unfolded in Germany, thousands of German nationals and German Americans faced a quieter, protracted form of detention in the United States itself. Under the authority of the Alien Enemies Act, enforced by Presidential Proclamation 2526, the U.S. government detained at least 11,000 ethnic Germans between 1940 and 1948. These individuals were held not as military POWs, but as civilian internees, deemed security risks, often based merely on national origin or suspicion of Nazi affiliation. Camps like Crystal City, Texas, Fort Douglas, Utah, and Fort Oglethorpe, Georgia, housed these German enemy aliens, sometimes as entire families. For women and children, this often meant detention far from their homes, sometimes classified as voluntary internees, reflecting the unique legal landscape of home front confinement. For the civilian internees detained stateside, camp life was defined by control and routine. While they were deprived of freedom, life in family camps like Crystal City allowed for organized communal existence, contrasting sharply with the chaotic conditions in occupied Europe. Detainees had access to cultural events, organized sports like soccer, post office services, and rationed goods from a camp store. Inmate labor was organized, with Japanese internees often handling farming and Germans working on machinery. Daily life revolved around managing limited resources, for instance requiring 2,500 quarts of milk for the nearly 1,600 children in Crystal City at its peak. Though civilian internment was less severe than the POW experience in Germany's later war years, it remained a life governed by military restrictions and prolonged uncertainty, continuing until August 1948 in some cases, well after the war ended. The task of processing and managing all German detainees, whether POWs overseas or civilians at home, exposed the deep racial and gender fault lines within the U.S. Army itself. The Women's Army Corps, which performed the crucial security and administrative tasks involving female prisoners, was a segregated institution. Notably, African-American WWII units, such as the famous 6888th Central Postal Directory Battalion, served overseas alongside German POWs. Furthermore, African-American Army nurses were controversially assigned to care for captured Nazi prisoners. This scenario created a profound paradox. Black American servicewomen, facing institutional racism and segregation within their own ranks, were tasked with enforcing the authority and democratic principles of the United States over white German personnel, including Nazis. This dual reality underscores the complex social and moral challenges of the U.S. military mission during occupation. For civilian women detained in civilian internment camps, such as Hohenasperg in the American Zone, the hope for release was caught in a massive bureaucratic bottleneck. Allied policy required every suspect to complete a detailed political questionnaire, the Fragebogen, designed to purge German society of Nazi influence. But this screening operation quickly ground to a halt. Allied counterintelligence staffs faced a crushing workload due to critical shortages of interrogators and even typists. By the end of 1945, roughly 100,000 civilian suspects remained detained. Recognizing the judicial logjam and administrative chaos, the U.S. Army began actively transferring control of the civilian internee camps and the entire screening process back to emerging German state officials, the Ministers for Political Liberation, starting in late 1946. The ultimate fate of these women was now in the hands of German tribunals known as Spruchkammern. The formal criteria for eventual release were contingent on local tribunals determining that the internees were not incriminated under the liberation law or if they were deemed medically unfit. However, the real driver was a seismic geopolitical shift. As the Soviet threat solidified into the Cold War, the Western Allies rapidly pivoted away from meticulous ideological denazification to prioritizing German political and economic stabilization. Denazification, widely unpopular and cripplingly slow, was increasingly viewed as an administrative liability. The comprehensive purging of society was relaxed and eventually dismantled by 1951. For the thousands of German women still classified as civilian internees, their protracted confinement ended when political expediency replaced punitive justice, allowing them to finally return to a homeland focused on reconstruction rather than reckoning.
For civilian women detained in civilian internment camps such as Hohenasperg in the American zone, the hope for release was caught in a massive bureaucratic bottleneck. Allied policy required every suspect complete a detailed political questionnaire, the Fragebogen, designed to purge German society of Nazi influence. But the screening operation quickly ground to a halt. Allied counterintelligence staffs faced a crushing workload due to critical shortages of interrogators and even typists. By the end of 1945, roughly 100,000 civilian suspects remained detained. Recognizing the judicial logjam and administrative chaos, the U.S. Army began actively transferring control of the civilian internee camps and the entire screening process back to emerging German state officials, the Ministers for Political Liberation, starting in late 1946. The ultimate fate of these women was now in the hands of German tribunals, known as Spruchkammern. The formal criteria for eventual release were contingent on local tribunals determining that the internees were not incriminated under the liberation law, or if they were deemed medically unfit. However, the real driver was a seismic geopolitical shift. As the Soviet threat solidified into the Cold War, the Western Allies rapidly pivoted away from meticulous ideological denazification to prioritizing German political and economic stabilization. Denazification, widely unpopular and cripplingly slow, was increasingly viewed as an administrative liability. The comprehensive purging of society was relaxed and eventually dismantled by 1951. For the thousands of German women, still classified as civilian internees, their protracted confinement ended when political expediency replaced punitive justice, allowing them to finally return to a homeland, focused on reconstruction rather than reckoning. The final civilian internee camps in the American zone were phased out by 1948. The journey of these captured German women ultimately split into three distinct fates, each determined by a rigid legal status. For uniformed military auxiliaries, the few female prisoners of war, their status guaranteed humane treatment and protection under the Geneva Convention, mirroring the welfare given to male POWs abroad. Their experience was defined by military courtesy and prompt repatriation. Conversely, the fate of civilian internees was one of prolonged uncertainty and hardship in camps like Hohenasperg, governed by the torturous political process of denazification. Finally, the most brutal category, the concentration camp guards or Aufseherrinnen, faced an uncompromising military justice system at Dachau. These convicted war criminals were denied POW status, segregated from other detainees, and judged harshly for crimes against humanity. The nature of their detention, military protection, political limbo, or criminal punishment, was a segmented reality of the post-war U.S. occupation.
The processing of German women by the U.S. Army stands as a profound historical intersection of legal adherence and unforeseen operational necessity. The international requirement for due regard to their sex meant that the WWII became the indispensable tool for adhering to the Geneva Conventions, performing critical security and searching roles that defied the Army's traditional combat exclusion policies.
General Dwight D. Eisenhower himself lauded the WAC's immeasurable contribution in the European theater, validating their unexpected deployment into zones of authority and physical responsibility over enemy personnel. Thus, the surrender of German women, from uniformed auxiliaries to convicted war criminals, provided the American Women's Army Corps with a fundamental operational precedent, proving their essential role and carving out a permanent, if often contested, position for women in the structure of the modern U.S. military.
The detention of civilian internees in Germany was physically and legally distinct from the treatment of military POWs. Camps like Hohenasperg, utilized as civilian internment Camp 76, relied on former German prison facilities near Ludwigsburg, providing a stark backdrop to their indefinite detention. Unlike military auxiliaries, who were generally protected by the generous Geneva Convention standards afforded to POWs, civilian women were held for security or policy reasons under the mandate of JCS 1067, pending political clearance. This led to a grim limbo, where political detainees were subject to bureaucratic capacity. The environment was often harsh and defined by scarcity, especially when compared to the generously supplied POW camps located on the American mainland. Their release hinged entirely on completing the torturous process of denazification, an attempt to remake German society that fueled long-term resentment among the interned women. Crucially, strict segregation was maintained, separating male and female detainees and particularly isolating women classified as war criminals or high-ranking SS auxiliaries from the general internee population. This small group of female perpetrators faced continued imprisonment in specialized facilities, such as the Barnum Street prison in the Soviet sector, due to the lack of dedicated space for female war criminals in the American zone. For the majority of civilian internees, their ordeal concluded not with military repatriation, but administrative release. As the emerging German federal states gradually assumed control of the local tribunals, known as the Spruchkammern, mounting Cold War pressures accelerated the process. The last official U.S. Army-managed civilian internment camps in Germany were formally dissolved by October 1948, marking the end of the military's direct management of mass political detention and transitioning the difficult legacy of reckoning entirely over to the nascent West German government. For civilian detainees remaining in occupied Germany, the camps were bleak. While male POWs shipped to the U.S. enjoyed abundant rations and comprehensive welfare far from the conflict, civilian internees housed in facilities like the former Hohenasperg prison faced profound scarcity and political detention. The nature of confinement was fundamentally different. These civilians were held without specific criminal charge, detained solely for security risk or Nazi affiliation under the mandate of JCS 1067. Although U.S. policy aimed to grant them treatment substantially similar to POW standards, the reality was dictated by post-war resource scarcity and the slow, cumbersome process of political vetting, an administrative purgatory that stretched on for years after the fighting stopped. The women detained for war crimes, primarily the concentration camp staff known as auxiliaries, existed in a separate legal world. They were classified as unprivileged belligerents and denied prisoner of war status, which was reserved for uniformed military personnel. The U.S. Army established military commission trials at Dachau, beginning shortly after liberation, to prosecute these lesser war criminals, conducting over 400 trials between 1945 and 1947. These convicted women were subject to strict segregation from the general population of political internees. The female guards, who were trained and ideologically conditioned for cruelty, including instruction on how to handle and shoot their service weapons, were pursued under the full punitive force of Allied military law for their roles in systematic atrocities against humanity.
The prosecution of figures like Ilse Koch, the notorious bitch of Buchenwald, turned the Dachau courtroom into a global spectacle. Koch, the only woman among 31 defendants in her August 1947 trial, drew attention based largely on gruesome, highly sensationalized allegations, such as the unproven claim of making items from human skin. This intense public focus on her individual case reflected a cultural need to frame female violence as a spectacular gendered monstrosity, often obscuring the wider reality of systemic female participation across the Nazi machinery. The U.S. military tribunals acted swiftly and decisively on cases of personal criminal activity, sentencing many concentration camp personnel for their direct crimes in the camps. Ultimately, the fate of the thousands of German civilian internees was sealed not by a tribunal of American justice, but by the geopolitical landscape of the Cold War. As early as 1946, the comprehensive denazification effort lost momentum, replaced by the urgent necessity to stabilize West Germany against the looming Soviet threat. The mass political screenings were cumbersome, unpopular, and administratively inefficient due to lack of trained staff. By late 1946, the U.S. Army actively began handing over responsibility for the civilian enclosures to German state tribunals, known as Spruchkammern. This transfer led to increasingly lenient judgments and the final abolition of the denazification program by 1951. Prolonged detention yielded to expediency, concluding this turbulent post-military chapter of the U.S. occupation by 1948.
The processing of German women encapsulates the U.S. Army's moral and logistical challenge after 1945. The international legal requirement to treat female prisoners with special respect inadvertently forced the integration of the Women's Army Corps into critical security roles, searching and guarding enemy personnel, paving the way for women's permanent place in the armed forces. General Eisenhower himself lauded the WAC's immeasurable contribution. Though the 1948 Women's Armed Services Integration Act affirmed women's service, it paradoxically introduced the combat exclusion policy, formally restricting women from ground combat positions. This legacy remains, a democracy that successfully processed its defeated enemies according to law, yet struggled internally to fully acknowledge and integrate the vital unconventional roles performed by its own women soldiers.